Welcome everybody to Chronic Fatigue and Fibromyalgia Update. I'm Dr. Richard Podell. We're welcoming back Dr. Alan Light. In this second segment of our interview, I'd like to discuss your key research on chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia in detail. You've identified objective changes in specific genes that match up with our typical patient's report that modest physical activity can flare up their symptoms for 24 hours or more. This new evidence should certainly help convince the doubters that the problems our patients report is caused by a physical and a biological process. So, welcome back, Dr. Alan Light.
Thank you.
Now, please tell us which patients you chose to study and what you measured. And then we'll walk our way through the study.
Okay. So, we work with a very talented physician, Dr. Cindy Bateman, who runs a large clinic here in the valley, in the Salt Lake Valley. She provided us with almost all the patients that we looked at. She selected patients that had considerable chronic fatigue syndrome. She tried to make them as severe as they could be, and also some that had somewhat less symptoms as well. So that was the bulk of the patients that we got. We also looked at controls that we tried to match to the age, but we couldn't really match them to the fitness because, as you know, chronic fatigue patients have fitness levels that no normal person really could have.
So you put them on an exercise bike, did you?
Yes. We put them on a Schwinn Airdyne exercise bicycle that actually you have to use your arms and your legs, so it's whole body. And we did that on purpose because we wanted to, since we're looking at blood, we wanted to make sure that blood was circulating the muscles that were working all over the body. Yep.
That's very clever. Okay. You measured them for, what is over 48 hours? You looked at the certain genes. You took the blood at 30 minutes, at 8 hours, was it 24 hours and 48 hours? Okay, so...
That's correct.
How did the patients feel? First we'll talk about the subjective. How did the patients feel after this, what we'll call a medium level of exercise? And then after that we'll talk about what did you find objectively on the lab?
So for most of the patients, immediately following the exercise, at least some of them felt somewhat better. Not all of them, but some of them felt somewhat better. But then beginning even just a few hours later, less than 8 hours later, they began to experience a lot more fatigue, and if pain was part of their symptoms, or even if it wasn't, pain began to increase as well. And they basically felt, some of them were totally wiped out. By 8 hours, they were very severely affected, and at 24 and 48 hours, many of them reported that their pain and fatigue was still either going up or had only begun to level off.
Okay, so we know that they got worse. The control group that you also tested, they didn't really bat an eye. So what did you find in the gene studies in the chronic fatigue people as opposed to the normal controls? For
the chronic pain patients, if we look at them as a group, there was a substantial increase in genes beginning at our first blood draw, 30 minutes after exercise. That increased somewhat more up to 8 hours, that being sort of the maximum time. Then the gene expression, and this is for nearly all the genes that we looked at, except oddly the immune genes, but they increased and stayed increased up to 48 hours. Now each individual patient, if we look at that, we see somewhat different profiles, that some begin to go up and go back down. Some go up and go way high, and what we found is if we looked at individual patients, that the individual gene expression for those patients matched the description of their fatigue and pain.
Okay, so the people who are tired for 48 hours had abnormal genes for 48 hours. People who are tired for 24 hours had the abnormal genes for 24 hours. That's really terrific proof. So. But you found actually two subgroups in the chronic fatigue syndrome, didn't you?
Right. So what I described to you was what we found for about 70%, 70 to 75% of the patients. For the other 30%, we found that in fact almost none of the genes did anything. And initially, I thought there was very little going on until Cindy Bateman pointed out to me that in fact something was missing in the group of patients that seemed to have nothing going on. And the something missing was because I hadn't used a log scale to look at it. As a result, I was missing the fact that they were all showing a very prominent decrease in an adrenergic receptor.
Okay.
And all of these patients had that very large decrease, and that was a very astounding finding, and that's also, of course, in the paper that we published.
Okay, now let me repeat that term, adrenergic receptor. What that means is a receptor that's involved with adrenaline. Now, the key thing, as I understand from this study, is that many of the people in this 30% group were the people that when they stand up, their blood pressure drops. And of course, adrenaline is involved in blood pressure. And as Cindy Bateman and I and anybody who treats chronic fatigue or severe fibromyalgia knows, there's a subgroup of people who drop their blood pressure. We call it orthostatic hypotension. The blood pressure goes down when they stand up. There's another variant of it called postural orthostatic tachycardia, meaning their heart rate goes up very rapidly. And what happens is these people are treated entirely differently. And what you've done is shown that the genetic manifestations of their illness are also different.
That's correct. And
yeah. So then there was another group that had just fibromyalgia and nothing else. They did not have a lot of chronic fatigue. That was a big surprise. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we thought that these patients would be somewhat different, but we weren't prepared for how different. So the patients that had only chronic fatigue really didn't show any changes in any of the genes following exercise. Instead, what we found, and this is again a big surprise, is we found at least 3 genes which were elevated simply at rest. So just sitting there before they ever started exercise, they had a change that their gene expression was already different than controls. And these were genes, again, that were responding to pain and also to adrenergic stimuli.
So it almost as if you're finding 2 different groups of chronic fatigue syndrome people, one where everything goes up, all the genes go up, and the other with the orthostatic hypotension where the adrenaline gene goes down. And maybe we're also finding 2 different kinds of fibromyalgia. Fibromyalgia with chronic fatigue syndrome, those people behave the same, the chronic fatigue people behave the same whether or not they have fibromyalgia. So we might almost consider their fibromyalgia as part of their chronic fatigue syndrome. And yet there's this other group of fibromyalgia people that don't have a lot of fatigue. Their gene manifestations are quite different. And it remains to be seen whether these are variations within single diseases or whether they're actually 2 different mechanisms of disease going on. So, any last words of what lessons can we take from this? What's the bottom line?
Yeah, so to me, one of the bottom lines is that, in fact, we need to look at fatigue as a system disorder. It's larger than just I feel tired. It's larger than my motor command signals shut down so I can't move anymore. It involves the cardiovascular system, it involves the brain, it involves virtually all parts of the body. So we need to treat this as a system disorder, and it's very possible that there are multiple ways to get for dysregulation of any part of that system, which will ultimately lead to almost all the symptoms that we know of as fatigue. So that's one of the things. And the second one is, though, that in fact we need to understand this, that both fatigue and chronic fatigue syndrome much better, and we can, given the tools that we have with gene expression and mass spec and lots of other tools that we're developing now. We need to stay on this and have a lot of research being done, because I think there's a good hope that we can actually come up with treatments and hopefully prevention.
Right. So what I'm hearing you say is this is a very promising area of research, and what follows from that is priority is to get some funding for it. So maybe we'll hold there. This is Dr. Alan Light that we've been talking with Dr. Richard Podell, Dr. Alan Light, about his groundbreaking research on the genetics of why chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia people feel worse for an extended period of time after modest exercise. There will be a segment 3 in which we're going to talk about the work that Dr. Light has done since his paper was published back in, I guess, early 2012. So we're now in 2014. I know that he's done more work since.